Hello, welcome to the first of more than one recorded lecture that we'll have for the rest of child psychology. A couple of things to note before we start on this. I'm going to try to keep it under an hour. I think I sent an email out that said it was going to be shorter than that. I really don't think that that's going to do justice to the stuff that we want to do. So hopefully they won't be too bad. Obviously it's recorded so you guys can not have to watch it all in one go. Remember, this is to supplement and kind of explain and expand a little bit on and clarify the stuff that's in the book. So definitely watch and read this as you need it. Um, but it's not going to be stuff that you can't find in the book, right? So we're not adding too much extra information there. The stuff on the test, you can be able to use the book, and if you take notes from this, right, it'll help you, and you'll be good to go there. Just like in class when we were still on campus. Third thing, I'm doing this one take, just like we would do in a class. So bear with me if there are technical difficulties or if I'm checking notes and looking off screen and it seems kind of weird because I'm not looking right at the camera. I've already discovered that I have a really hard time not looking at the little video it has of my own recording. So my eyes will be all over the place, and hopefully that's not too distracting, but I thought it was a little bit better than just a PowerPoint with my voice over it. The other thing, if you hear any weird sounds in the background, that's probably Zachary running around because it's a little bit before bedtime when I'm recording this one, but trying to get it in before it gets too late and my cognitive functioning goes down. Hopefully everybody has been safe, you're healthy, you're doing well. Just to throw out there, if you have questions about the class or you need anything with regards to that, please let me know. I haven't seen many emails other than to let me know when things on Canvas aren't working, which I greatly appreciate, by the way. And then also as an advisor, of course, some of you have different advisors. Please, like we've been saying, if there's anything you need, if there's any questions you have, if you're uncertain about anything with regards to ACU, please let us know and we'll do our best to help you. So with that, we'll get into it. Chapter 9, we're talking about language development. And you can see here a couple of the main ideas that we'll be going over. We're going to talk about the 5 basic aspects of language. I think it's important to know kind of the basic building blocks of it, just like with anything else we've talked about, right? We need some common definitions. We need some things we can measure and talk about. And also the way we learn language, right? Like we learn the parts of language. Even though we do it naturally, we also expand our knowledge by understanding the constituent parts. The parts of the brain that are specialized for language. We'll talk a little bit about the brain structure. Of course, some basic theories about how children develop language. That'll be the meat of what we do, and also how that changes over time. How does our language acquisition and use and understanding of it change as we grow and develop cognitively and emotionally and socially? And then a little bit at the end about how children learn to read and write. You'll notice in the book there's some stuff about bilingual instruction and some other really, really good, interesting things, but in the interest of time, especially in the online format, we're going to cut a little bit of those things out. Doesn't mean they're not important, but they're not as central to the universal kind of language experience, right? So apologies to anyone that finds those interesting. I find them especially interesting, especially in a state like Texas, where we have millions of children that are educated bilingually, right? It'd be an important topic and unfortunately one that we can't cover quite as well. So moving on to the basic aspects of language. So these are the building blocks, right? Obviously language, right? A system of symbols that is used to communicate with others and in our thinking, right? Words are symbols that stand in for other things. We've talked in cognitive development about how that's an important milestone where we can understand symbols, and humor, right, is a great aspect of that. When we learn that words can have multiple meanings and can be funny, right? Because we're using an unexpected meaning. Like we understand that a word and the thing it represents are different, which, right, is pretty esoteric and abstract, but that's the way it is. And so these are the different building blocks, and we'll talk about these in a little bit more detail. Phonology is the sounds of language, right? So that's just the actual noises we make with our mouths, right? That we assign meaning to. So phonemes are the smallest distinct sounds in a particular language. So in the word go, right? An example would be the g sound and the o sound. You know, they're a little bit different than syllables, right? Because a syllable might have multiple sounds that put together, but these are the actual physical building blocks. So any of y'all that are comm disorders, right, or you know someone that wants to be a speech pathologist, this is really important for them. It's called articulation typically when they're working with students that have issues with this, where, you know, I'm having a physical difficulty producing a sound, right, and making language that way. And of course, different languages have different sounds. R and L in English, right, are not really differentiated in a lot of Asian, especially Eastern Asian languages. And so that's why you kind of get that, you know, when you have someone who's not a native English speaker and still has a strong accent and is learning, they have a hard time coming from like Chinese to English, right? And R's and L's kind of sound interchangeable. Another example would be V and B in Spanish, right? Are very, very similar. In fact, my understanding is a lot of times they're not really different at all, even if written the letter they are. So that's just one example, a couple of examples of how these are different across languages and different for different people, right? Morphology then is the way words are formed from sounds and how they relate to other words. So a morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning in language. So that's more like the actual word meaning parts, like how we break things up. So the example you can see on the screen right there, cats has two morphemes. The cat, right, which is the word for cat and what that animal is, and the S, which we know makes it plural, means more than one cat, right? That S is a unit of meaning, right? Because it's telling us something important about what we're trying to communicate. Just like a phoneme is like the physical sound, the smallest unit. Again, morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning. So when you have big, long words, right? Think about when you were learning, especially if you took Latin or if you were, that kind of particular nerd. I was, nerdy in other ways, not Latin, but there's those root words, right, that come together and they all tell us different things. If you know enough about that, you can kind of guess what that meaning means. ING might be another example, right? Something that's currently happening in the present. That's what that means. Syntax is the grammar, right, of a language. Semantics is the meaning of words, and pragmatics is how language used. So let me break these down just a little bit, right? Syntax, exactly what it sounds like, grammar, the rules of how we put words together, right? Every language has them differently. Even, there's the official, like Queen's English that we all use, or academic English, and then there's the way that we just speak, as normal people, which is different from how we write, but there are typically rules that we follow in language, and we kind of have to, right? Otherwise, nobody knows what they're doing and you can't communicate. Semantics then are the meaning of words. You ever heard the phrase like, well, we're just arguing semantics, right? When you're having a debate with someone, at Thanksgiving about politics, you're arguing about what it means to be fair or something like that. Well, we have different definitions of that, right? And so if we don't have that common meaning, then our whole argument is thrown off. That's where that phrase comes from, because semantics is what the actual meaning of this word is. And that's important, right? As we talked about, some words have different meanings. Some words have very vague meanings. And so we have to have a lot of context in there. And that's where pragmatics comes in, how language is actually used, right? So this, again, difference between maybe how things are written and how they're spoken, how in different contexts things are used, right? You speak differently in different contexts. You would talk to me differently, right, in class or in an advising meeting that you probably do with your friends than you do with your grandma, hopefully. You talk different to your grandma than you talk to everybody else, right? And this is an important thing that we also learn, again, developmentally with language. What contexts are certain words and certain types of speaking useful in? And then, of course, just like even culturally, right? Like some languages even have it built into the syntax, right? Where there's formal and informal ways of speaking to people. And the actual words I choose, not just the meaning of them, but the, this word in the word itself, and, implies a certain level of respect, maybe, right? Or I'm speaking to someone who's older or younger than me or something like that, right? So these are the building blocks. Again, they're important because if you really get into studying how people are learning language, like we can have issues in all of these, right? And we develop different abilities in these at different speeds. But just think back to when you learn to read in school, and that's changed throughout the decades. We'll talk a little bit about that, but you did this stuff. Like, who diagrams sentences, right? If you diagram sentences in middle or high school, that's syntax and a little bit semantics, right? And understanding that. And the better you understand that, the better maybe you're able to craft language or understand what other people are saying to you, even though nobody, when they're talking, thinks about this stuff explicitly, or most people don't anyways, right? So in the structure of our brain, right, there's a couple different areas that are really important to remember when it comes to language processing and use, okay? There's Broca's area, which is involved in speech production. It's located near the motor center, and it produces the movement of the lips and tongue, which of course are essential to producing language. So this is, again, the motor function. And maybe we don't always think about that. And we've talked about this in some other topics too, where, what we're physically able to do sometimes can affect the more abstract areas of how we function and how we interact with each other. Damage in this area of the brain produces problems in producing speech and the tendency to use only essential words. So somebody with damage to Broca's area might speak in more halted sentences. They might pronounce things incorrectly. They might not be able to physically produce a word, even though cognitively they can. So when they talk, that might be reflected in their behavior, right? I might use the simplest words I can. I think it's The Office, right? Kevin, why use a lot word when few word do trick, or whatever he says. That kind of thing, but not as a joke, right? We're actually doing that because of maybe some damage. So you can see Broca's area number 4 there, more towards the motor center in the temporal lobe, right? Then we have Wernicke's area, which is written and spoken language comprehension, number 8, getting back more into the occipital parietal lobes, kind of in between there, right? So in Wernicke's area, we're talking about understanding and creating meaning rather than the physical production of speech. Damage here means we have trouble maybe understanding and making sense of what people are saying, but we don't have any trouble producing the words because the physical abilities are all there. But it's in the processing, right? Either input or output. And why that's important is because we do distinguish between those two things, expressive versus receptive language, right? Which is the differences between comprehension or receptive language, what I can understand that people are saying, right? Do I understand all the meanings and the context and the nuance and all that kind of stuff, versus expressive, whereas what I'm able to produce. Throughout our lives, people generally understand more words than they're able to produce. And just think about it, right? Like, when you're listening, you can listen to someone who's way smarter than you, that uses way bigger words than you do, or it maybe talks way fast, and you can still understand what they're saying and you can still follow them. But if we ask you to repeat that, or we ask you to use your own words, depending on the topic, maybe I can't do that. Almost all of us are better at listening than we are public speaking, right? Unless you tried really, really hard and come to 11 and got a great grade, then yeah, your receptive language is going to be more than your expressive. And almost universally, because of that, comprehension is greater than production, like we're talking about, with a few exceptions. And, especially if we get into disorders and damage to the brain and things like that. But even just some of us have better skills in certain areas, right? But generally how we just function at people, we do a lot more listening than we do talking, because we're one person and everyone else is a zillion people, and there's a lot going on that's happening there. All right. So that's kind of the building blocks of it, right? Really quickly, kind of what's going on structurally, right? We've got our expressive and receptive language that are based on certain areas in our brain, and those are processing these morphemes and these phonemes and the syntax and the semantics to produce what we understand when we speak and listen to each other. Okay, what does this have to do with psychology, and why are we talking about it? Well, think about it, especially for children, right, who don't have all of their language skills. They're developing them like everything else, right? How we communicate and interact socially and emotionally is based on language. I mean, you just think about, telling people how you feel. Isn't that hard sometimes? You don't always have the language, and then maybe use a word differently than they do, or they say something and you don't pick up everything that they actually meant to say. That's why this is important. I'm married to a therapist. She's about 800 million times better at talking about her feelings than I am, right? And so that language development, there's different emotional and skills or whatever, but like that's language. If I can't put things into words accurately for her, then, our interaction as husband and wife is affected, right? So that's why it's important. And that's why we're talking about the different theories of language development. We've got 4 big ones that we'll talk about: behaviorism and social cognitive learning theory, which probably already tells you all you need to know just about that. Nativism, which we'll get into, interactionism, and cognitive processing theory, right? So starting with behaviorism, this is exactly what it sounds like. All the other, how you would apply behaviors in every other aspect of human function, right? It's shaped by operant conditioning, by learning through our environment. So this isn't something we're born with or something we have. We gain it through exposure and repeated use of it, right? So mothers who vocalize more have children who vocalize earlier, right? Because they're exposed more and they learn more and they see the results, and they're, again, conditioned. What positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement is made when I create a sound? And again, think about it. I talk to my baby, right? And I'm smiling when I'm doing that. So I'm linking those things. And then the baby makes a sound and I say, yay, good for you, hooray, as opposed to like not reacting to it. Well, that's teaching the baby that vocalizing is good. So they would vocalize more. The criticism of this theory is that language is way too complex to be learned that way, right? How do children know what's being reinforced? There's so many variables. We already talked about it. Are you happy because the sounds I made, the meaning I made, the context? I mean, think about it all the time, right? It's not what you said, it was your tone. All of us have heard that at one point, right? Well, unless someone tells us, how do we know what they got mad about? Was it what I said or how I said it, right? So that's kind of the biggest criticism. Although, of course, there are certain aspects that are true in this. And for me, particularly, almost everything, even behavior itself, like what do we actually do, the actions we take, if we're breaking it, if we're being that broad, with behaviorism is hard, right? Because things are so complex. Do we really know what's being reinforced, or is it a little bit murkier, right? Social cognitive learning theory kind of builds off this and says we learn by imitation, which makes a little bit more sense, has fewer detractors, right? Because we're just copying what we're hearing, right? We see that something happens, we just say it, and it kind of jives with what we understand about kids, right? Kids will just repeat and say stuff even though they don't really know what it means, just to kind of see what happens, right? So there's still that conditioning aspect of it, but it's a lot more on that, again, back to Bandura, like observing and imitating and seeing that it is just like I do something at random, and however my environment reacts to it, that's what is shaped over time. They interact a little bit there. And this is pretty popular. And again, I don't think anyone completely rejects this out of hand, but it is, it's certainly not the only way of looking at it. So there's also nativism. Nativism is pretty popular. A guy named Noam Chomsky, you may have heard of him. He's super famous, is kind of the big proponent of this. He has this idea of universal grammar, right? The idea that language is something that is innate to the human experience. It's something that we're innately wired to learn, that we're, like, it's hardwired into our brain before we do anything or ever even physically capable of speaking a word. So we already have grammatical structures in our brain. Like the way we just interpret cognitively the world, even before we speak, is organized in a grammatical way. And now, not grammar in the sense like different languages, right, have different syntax and rules, but the idea that like subject and predicate, right? Predicate is the thing that verbs, right? And subject is, those are different in different languages, but every language has one, right? Because we have objects and we have actions and we understand that, and that is in our language. This one's a little hard to wrap your head around, but I have a good example of it. But before we get to that, he kind of called this universal grammar, or the structure we have in our brain for universal grammar, the language acquisition device, right? That structure that's hardwired and then it's activated by hearing language in the environment. So we're exposed to things. We already have this pre-programmed filter and structure to kind of put this information in and organize it with, right? The example of this is, for these rules of inborn language, the most famous one is over-regularization, where we apply rules of language even though we've never heard them. So little kids will say, I winted, or I goed, right? They're applying those rules before they've been explicitly taught them, just from like kind of soaking it up and things happening to them, right? And that the whole idea that like kids make up words. Like, how do you make up a word if you don't know the rules for words? It's just processing through your brain, right? And because we do that at such a young age before we're even really verbal, there's evidence in the way we respond to things. Think about how we test young children. There's something to this, that we come pretty pre-programmed for this. And again, he would say literally before we're born. Others might say it's a little bit after. There's some learning that happens there, but it's pretty close. Splitting hairs, maybe, not really. Obviously, it's a pretty big question, but for our purposes, that's the idea, is that before I'm even born, I've got this pre-programmed, and language is just bam, bam, bam. That's how I'm learning it so fast. And I'm learning so much so fast, right? Faster than maybe I learn other things. Moving on to interactionism is exactly like it sounds. Like almost every theory has one of these, right? Biological readiness to learn language, something like nativism, interacts with our environment to allow that learning. So language is created socially, right? Through parents, like your environment, who's talking to you, right? But I have some pre-programming. I'm ready to learn it. Like, and some of us are going to be better at it than others, right? And this happens. We see this with kids, right? Some kids start speaking earlier. Some kids have bigger vocabularies earlier. There's research to suggest that the higher level of education your parents have, the better your vocabulary is going to be. Well, that makes sense. They know more words. They're going to use bigger words. So you're going to learn to be exposed to those earlier. In fact, people that are, more upper middle class, their kids tend to do better at reading and writing and speaking and things like this a little bit because their parents talk to them more, because they have time to. If I'm working at night when I'm not with my kid, or if I have the kind of job where I have more free time, we tend to see people in those socioeconomic statuses interacting with their kids verbally a little bit more for a lot of different reasons. And we see the results of that. So there's a lot of good evidence for interactionism, that my environment does work with my innate behavioral ability. And a good example is adults recasting what children say into more advanced language. So a kid might say, me want this. And you're like, you're right. You do want the cereal, right? Or are you trying to tell me that you're hungry, right? Are you sad because this? They might say, well, I'm sad because you were mean. And you're like, well, are you sad because I told you no and you really, really wanted to do this and it's hard to wait? Using examples from my own life today, literally, right? And so that's that example. Like, of course, this is something we do, and it has value and validity because we see that it works, and this is the underlying process that our biology is interacting with that environment. So it's not solely the environment like behaviorism. It's not solely natively what we are born with, right? It's kind of in between there. And then there's the cognitive processing model, which if you think back to cognitive processing, right, we're taking in information, we're sorting it, we're organizing, we're making those connections, right? As far as just learning anything. So if we apply that to language, it's a process of taking the data. Children hear around the world and they process it like a computer does, and it goes in certain buckets, and we learn nouns and verbs and adjectives, even if we don't know the words, because we see how they're used. And as we learn that certain words can be an adjective and a verb or whatever, or a verb can be a noun, and it's this whole weird thing. Again, we don't talk about it necessarily, although eventually we learn it. But it's connecting to prior things. And this is meaning, this is grammar, this is morphemes, right? It's all of that. And your learning relies on your computational ability. So this is statistical learning is what it's called in this. So it's how often, how frequently do I hear these types of words together, or these types of sounds together, right? So infants, the evidence for this is that infants differentiate words in a big, long stream of speech from the frequency with which syllables end up next to each other. So they tend to start, the more they hear that pattern over and over again, Like these different sounds are always near each other. When they hear a different one, they attune more to the patterns they've heard before, right? Again, statistics. Oh, my brain unconsciously, you can hear the dogs barking. My brain unconsciously is, saying, oh, that's more likely. I've heard that before. So I'm expecting this next thing to happen. So Google this is a really cool thing when you look up like fake words, people reading, and when you hear those things that sound like fake words, why do they still sound like a word? If you've ever seen something like that, well, because they're kind of following these statistical rules, and our brain is assuming things and kind of making some leaps about this. And this theory kind of explains how we're able to learn language so fast, right? Because our brain is trying to predict. And again, going back, right, we've got these schemas. We're trying to, that's what our brain's doing, right? We have models and we're expecting things to fit in, right? Like that experience expectant brain development where it's like, okay, I expect this to happen. If it does, that confirms it. And if it's different, I'm like, oh, wow. And now I have to accommodate this new information and change my model. That's what's going on here with language. So those are the big theories. I know we hit those really fast, but you can fall back on your book and kind of look through them. But those are the big ideas, right? It's that interplay between innate ability and the environment, and then a little bit my brain processing, right? Which is kind of that innate ability, but it's different than nativism because it's my cognitive functions, not my hardwired like structure in my brain, right? So as we go through the lifespan, it's very interesting how we develop, because prenatally, we know, we've already talked about in class, a fetus can hear a lot of stuff in utero. And we've talked about this, I think, a little bit before. The infants prefer the sound of their mother, to other things, and we attune to the voice. But what's really interesting is they prefer her like reading a book when they hear it read prenatally to the sound of her reading something else. So it's like, we can't speak at all, right? We don't know the meaning of words. But if I read you green eggs and ham 100 times when you're in your mother's womb and then you're born, and I read you fox and socks instead, you are not, as an infant, going to prefer that sound compared to me reading green eggs and ham again. Now, it's novel, right? You'll attune to it and you'll understand, like they would anything. But they're going to show preference for something that's familiar. Again, that language is being absorbed already. This, again, another bit of evidence in the favor of that nativism, that we're predisposed to want to understand language and to be attracted to it, right? And they also show a preference for the language their mother speaks. Makes sense. They've been hearing it in utero for 9 months or longer, right? Whatever they're speaking. And so especially if you are born in a place where there's a lot of different languages, again, they attune to novel things, but they're also going to attune to things that they expect. And again, they show that preference for the thing that connects them to their parents. Pretty good adaptive trait, right? And infants, they're pre-verbal, right? But they still communicate. And there's a lot of different ways they do it. Crying, obviously, communicates a pretty powerful message, right? Things like cooing, which are these soft sounds that baby make. Their first sounds we're able to produce at all, right? And they kind of sound like that, ooh, ooh, Zachary used to go ooh all the time. He would even copy us when we did it. And then those are those sweet little sounds they make that, kind of the precursor to conversation, right? Because they tend to take turns. Zachary was a little baby. I would put it in there. I would hold him and I would go, ooh, and he would go, ooh, back. Normally in class, I would show a video. I may post it. It depends, but a video I have of him of this next stage babbling where he's yelling at me from inside his little playpen, and it has like rhythm to it. And he's like, blah, 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 daddy, and it's nothing, right? He's looking right at me and he's clearly talking to me, but none of it is words. And that's like kind of the next stage before we start using real words, right? We have that rhythm down. This is about 4 to 6 months old, where we're combining different sounds and syllables. And they tend to be one, that we can produce physically, and 2, statistically, that we hear together a lot. And so then, 6 to 8, they kind of start combining those into more sophisticated strings of babbles and things like that. We're not just making random noise. There's some kind of purpose to it, even if it's not following the rules yet. And this is what we talked about, right, already. More stuff that's just like class, where I talk about something before we actually get to the slide, right? Begins reflexive, the crying, but then becomes attentional. And like, if you've been around little kids, you know this, right? Like, even when we get older, we still cry when we want to, right? And sometimes it's just, I got hit in the knee and it hurts. Other times it's, I'm going to put on a little bit of a show because you made me angry, right? That's what happens. Again, a little bit about the cooing starts early. Beginning, the back and forth is the important thing to remember there. And then the babbling, right? A variety of sounds. It's expressive, right? And what's really interesting across cultures, the words and languages from mother and father or mom and dad tend to originate from the earliest sounds we're able to make in that language and what we hear a lot, which is kind of cool, I think. So that's their expressive language. How are they receiving it? Well, infants can distinguish sounds made in all languages around the world. They're able to pick up on those phonemes, right? More evidence that Noam Chomsky knew what he was talking about. So by 7 months, their perception has narrowed to include mostly the language they're hearing. So over time, we narrow, again, that statistical learning. So there's another evidence for that theory, that as we hear things more often, our brain starts to filter out the stuff that seems to be kind of extraneous, right? We're saying, well, I hear those combinations all the time. I'm going to pay attention to those because they seem important, because there's more frequency. You might argue that's a little bit behaviorism too, reinforcement, right? When I make these noises that I hear all the time, people actually listen to me. So that's, I mean, in our first year of life, you can see this is very, very early on, right? The big thing for young children, right, is interacting with adults. So when babies look at or point at what they see, adults that engage in this shared attention, where it's like, I'm looking at you as the older, more developed person, seeing what you're looking at and then telling you what it is. Do you see the doggies? Like, you know, go to the zoo when you see little kids. If you were still allowed to do that, and that's where you chose, you know, in Abilene to observe families, and I have kids students do this every year for their papers. You know, it's like I noticed this, like you talked about in class, and every little kid, mom and dad are like, look what they're doing. They're eating, or he's climbing, or that's the baby zebra, you know, and, you know, boy lions have the mane and girl lions don't, you know what I mean? Stuff like that. Like you're putting it and you're describing. And so part of that is the actual information, right? But part of it is the language practice. Like, that's what this is called. That's what that is called, right? If you read a book, it's the same thing. We're directing our attention to the same thing. And then I, as the more advanced person, am adding some important context, right? Think the scaffolding, if we're talking Vygotsky. So just like I'm doing right now, as you can see on the video, that gesturing may enhance language learning in several ways. But adults tend to differ the amount and type of gesturing they do with infants. It's bigger. It's more exaggerated, right? We're really emphasizing. It's like, wow, you're so big. When you see somebody, you put your arms wide. You're like, aren't you so excited? Oh, I know. Aren't you sad? I can see that you're sad. Oh, I'm so sorry. You know, I mean, facial expression, everything becomes exaggerated, right? The tone that we use is exaggerated. I mean, not just baby speak, that's part of it, but like we go over the top, right? Because they don't know as much about the words. They're still learning that kind of stuff. And so they need that extra context to be able to get and internalize that information. And then some families also like a bigger extension. This signing with your young kids is becoming more and more popular, especially as research has revealed it does not slow language development and actually helps foster it. You're not going to be like, well, I don't need to learn how to say please because I can rub my chest and say please with sign language. No, it helps them practice those communication skills before physically they can make the words. It's really funny when Zach was young, and you see a lot of kids do this, like as they start to gain the words, they might still do it. And so Zach would start to say please. And then if we said no, he would say please, and he'd start rubbing too. It's like both of them together. It's like, I really want this. I'm trying to communicate the seriousness. So it's helpful to them, you know, as they're limited still in their language skills to express more complex feelings and ideas, right? And then there's also this idea of child-directed speech, which I talked about a little bit. We use that higher-pitched voice. We exaggerate it. We talk more slowly. It's like, you are such a good girl, aren't you? Look at you. You're so smart. Look how you do. You know, that's how you would talk to a kid if you were being happy. And if you're mad, like, Zachary, that is not what we do when we are angry. What's a good choice when we are angry, right? That slow, that exaggerated stuff that we do. So the hypothesis here is to increase their attention to it, right? Because we're changing our cadence, we're changing our tone. So we're letting them know, hey, this is really important. Listen to me. And then what's, again, interesting about this is it's similar across languages and cultures. Like they might not do it the exact same way, but they all do that when talking to kids. Change how they're talking to them in order to foster that. So early on, really the big thing to remember, other than, you know, how we're gathering it and where that starts, is how important the adults in our lives are to our language development. So again, interactionism, that environment is going to be very important. It's not just your innate ability. It's going to be how rich of an environment it is, how much attention is being directed to you, how often can people read with you or talk to you or things like that. And so it's really important to remember how crucial the environment is early on. And we talked about this a little bit, but here it is on the slide again, right? The large differences across socioeconomic statuses in the amount and the quality of child-directed speech, right? How sophisticated is the language? How often they even talk to? And these differences have important consequences for later. And this is where some of that difference that we've already talked about in expected achievement for socioeconomic statuses. There's a lot of different reasons. It's not just like money, because not everyone even goes to private school, right? I mean, if you went to public school, you know, there's people all across the financial spectrum there. It's all the other stuff that financial flexibility and therefore the time flexibility allows you when you're in there. And you know, again, having important implications for how we educate our children. And it tends to start early, of course, right? We just talked about the importance of early language development and continue as they get older. So if we're moving on to toddlers, right, at a year, babies, they only have a few words, but by 2, it's exploded to like way more. We just exponentially are gaining words. And we call that a vocabulary burst, right? A period of time in which new words happen rapidly. And by 2, they understand that words are symbols for things in the world. We, go back to Piaget, right? This is where we're understanding that kind of stuff. Some children might learn words more gradually, but toddlers is when that vocabulary explodes. Just think about if you've got a cousin, right, that's about this age, or a niece or a nephew or a friend's kid or something like that you don't see that often, like how different they're talking from 1 month to the next at this age. And what they're doing while they're learning this language, and part of the reason why they're able to do this so quickly, is that they use these things called constraints. And this is really important. There'll be I believe, a test on, or a question on your test about this, but these constraints, which are assumptions and principles, right, about vocabulary and about things. So they start to form hypotheses, right, about the names or things. So we know we have a couple ways we do this. We have a bias for whole word object. We kind of assume that something, when you point at something, we understand it's the whole thing. So go back to my zoo example I'll use here for all of these. I point at the lion and I say, look, there's a lion. Well, the kid doesn't assume that the lion is the face or the paw or the claws or the tail. They're going to assume that I'm saying that's applying to the whole thing that I'm directing their attention to, right? Which is generally how words work, at least at that stage. Okay, so that's kind of a bias. And so we see, based on the mistakes they might make, right, where they call something the wrong, they'll understand that's the part, right? So look at his big neck. They might not understand that if you're talking about giraffe, like you say giraffe later, they've latched on to maybe that word first. There's the mutual exclusivity constraint, where there's only one name for an object, so any other name must refer to a different object. You think back to cognitive processing theory, right? Accommodation versus assimilation, right? A dog is a dog. And if you say pooch instead of dog, I'm assuming a pooch is a different thing. And you'll hear little kids be like, that's not a pooch, that's a dog. Because they don't understand that there can be different things, right? We kind of operate that each thing has its own word, right? Until we learn that there are or even after we learn that there are symbols for things. It's like that word goes with that thing and there's one, right? Which makes sense. It's more complex to understand. You might have 10 words for something, right? It doesn't make practical sense maybe to have 10 words for something. And we understand that later, right? And then there's these taxonomic constraints, which is this idea that like anything that has features in common, right? They have like a common name, but each object also has its individual name. So again, think back to your schemas, right? I understand that, I've used this example 100 times already, I know this semester, right? An animal versus a horse and a cow. Understanding that those two things are different. That's an important language thing. So once we're able to understand, okay, words based on taxonomy, right? That, okay, this is a word in this category. This is a word in that category. So if I hear something, I can make an assumption if I know what category it's in. There's something about the meaning I can kind of infer about that, right? Without having to be told the definition. And that's why kids can learn these things so fast, because all of these skills, no one's explicitly teaching this to them, right? These are skills and heuristics that they're using to make quick assumptions, run through their statistical model, and then understand based on that something without having to be told the explicit, because how exhausting would that be? And we'd never learn any language if that was how we learned, right? If we just only learn things by explicitly being told them, or when it comes to language anyways. They'd use 2 other kids of all ages, but it starts kind of around that toddler stage and a little bit beyond that. 2 other ways of learning language, which are syntactic and semantic bootstrapping. So bootstrapping is that idea of like connecting things based on common information. So they use the knowledge they have in one domain of language, like word meaning, to learn in another language domain, like word order. So it's like, okay, I know that this word means that. So if it comes before this other word, then it's describing it, like what an adjective is, right? Or vice versa. I don't know what that word means, but it came before dog. So that must be, it's not dog. I know dog's the thing. So this must be something else about it. That's like specifying it or differentiating it from a different thing, right? Connecting between different domains of knowledge, right? Meaning and rules. Okay. If there's ed at the end, and I know that that's a rule, whether explicitly or not, and I hear a new rule with that at the end, okay, I kind of know something about it, so I can infer a little bit of the meaning and think, okay, that's something someone does, right? Even if I have no idea what it means. And they don't think this explicitly, right? But it's what's going on. And then fast mapping is that process by which you learn new words, often after a single exposure. That's just used to describe this whole thing where it's like, it sticks in your brain, right? And you all know this, right? A kid hears a word once, he's repeating it over and over and over again. He's never going to forget it. It's almost never the words we want them to remember, right? Any bad word Zachary knows, he's not learned from me. It's been somebody else, I'm sure. But he won't stop repeating it, right? Or any other new word. They just use it over. You teach a kid a new word and they repeat it endlessly until it drives you crazy. They also, another technique they use, and there's a lot of these, and I know we're going through them fast, so go back and read in the book that tends to have some more examples than I'm using. Telegraphic speech. This sounds like a telegram because inconsequential words are left out. So think about how little kids speak. We're still talking about little kids. This example, want bear versus I want the bear. Go back to adults using, right, recasting in the more advanced language. This is where this comes in, right? Because we're following all the syntactic rules. Kids are not. And so they're using the most efficient thing because they're operating based on meaning. Those rules are still developing. And so even though they know them, but think about the order they're going to do it. They're not going to say bear want in English because intrinsically they kind of know that's not how it goes and that's what they've heard. But they're going to cut some of that extra stuff out that's a little bit harder to remember and a little bit more abstract, right? Like I is yourself is kind of an abstract concept. We'll talk more about self-development in a different unit, but right, that's not something you can wrap your head around easily, right? And if you're talking about understanding that words are symbols, like the, what does the mean? There's no thing that the stands for, right? It's just like a function of language. So that's kind of there. And as we're moving into early and middle childhood, right, we tend to see some social patterns that emerge with language, egocentric speak. And, all kids this age and every aspect of the development we've talked about are very egocentric. So children's inability to take the role of other people in conversations, think Piaget, right? I'm egocentric. I don't have theory of mind for you yet. It's me. I don't understand your feelings. I don't understand that you want different things from me. And that reflects in the language as well, too. They refer to themselves a lot more. They refer to something that's yours as theirs. It's not always about possession, although it can be. But possession kind of implies that I understand somebody else might want something. If I don't yet, I'm never going to use that's yours first, right? There's also private speech. We've talked about this before in learning, where we talk to ourselves. It begins aloud and increasingly becomes silent, right? Just a reminder, Vygotsky, that's an important language development tool. In addition to whatever patterns, right, scripts of behavior that I'm working out, cognitive processes, it's also practicing the language, right? And if my language is out of order, right, I match it up to what I'm doing, and it's going both ways, right? The language is helping me remember what I'm doing. What I'm doing is helping reinforce those rules of language, because if I say it wrong and I'm following what I'm saying mentally or verbally, then it's like, wait, maybe those words weren't right, and I need something about the meaning or the order of them right needs to be redone. Discourse skills, the ability to understand information and that logical. So again, think back to Piaget. As I move into concrete operations, right, I'm able to understand rules and logic. That flows with language as well, too. So, but on a more, not abstract, right, but on a more structural level. So we're able to understand, well, based on what you just said, that doesn't make any sense. Like tense, if I switch tenses when I'm telling a story too much, people get lost. As I move into middle childhood, I'm able to pick up on that. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm confused now because I caught those rules of language and you're not following them. And who are we talking about? When are we talking about now? And I'm tying it to time, right? There's also these meta-linguistic abilities. So we think about language and how to use it. This is where humor comes in, right? Like younger children, school age, they are starting to develop this ability to use words beyond their literal meaning, right? Understanding metaphors and sarcasm, right? And things like that. Like sarcasm is a meta-linguistic ability because it's my tone and it's my context. It's not just the words, right? Because that's the whole point, right? Like I'm using the words like opposite of what they mean. Like, oh, good for you. That's great that happened, right? I'm being sarcastic because I'm like, no, that actually sucks, and I think it's hilarious, right? Like that communicates something different. So, oh no, I'm totally not mad. I'm totally fine with the fact that you just did that. Please, no, cut me off in traffic, right? Well, what I'm saying says that I'm okay with it, but my tone says something very differently. It's that meta-linguistic ability that they start to pick up on in middle childhood, right? And again, humor. This is where all humor comes from, other than just like, physical body humor or like you fell down and that's funny. This is like, I can tell a joke. When you can understand a knock-knock joke, they're all plays on words. Or the most evil of jokes until you become a dad, the pun, right? Nobody thinks, how you doing, hungry? I'm dad is funny until you actually are a dad, right? Then it becomes the funniest thing in the world, mostly because it aggravates people. But you have to understand the interaction, right, between meaning and words and context in order to get that. And then teenagers, right? We've got all the skills for the most part, and we're just refining them. Our speech becomes more adult-like, but they're more likely, adolescents, to use slang or made-up words, especially when talking amongst themselves. I know that I'm cool, which is self-slang, and there's other words for that right now. But I know that I'm cool because I understand the difference between a banger and a bop. Okay, like Not everyone my age does, let me tell you. My friends who are all in their 30s, like me, because I'm a normal person and have mostly friends my own age. They get really mad at me when I use words like yeet or fam, or I'm trying to think what was the one the other day. They've slowly adopted. For a while they resisted whenever something was bad. They'd tell me something bad that happened in their day, and I would just text them back and just be like, oof, right? They'd be like, this is dumb. You're not a kid, Grant. Stop talking like that. But we've all kind of adopted it. My personal favorite, because I watch a lot of sports, is somebody asks me what happens in the Hawks game or whatever, and frequently, unfortunately, I have to say the dudes took an L. That happens all the time, right? But those are just small examples. If we compare across decades, right? Go back and watch Grease. What are they talking about? What kind of words are they using? Back to the Future is a great example of it, right? I think he does it multiple times in that, where he says something's cool or whatever, and they're like, what does that have to do with the temperature or whatever? That's not, an example, that wasn't how they used that language then. And they tend to change language and make it their own. And that'll make more sense when we talk about emotional identity. It's a big part of what teenagers are doing all the time, right? So just talk a little bit more about vocabulary, right? You can see that it increases, right, over time, and it's kind of exploding, like the number of these words, and you can see the socioeconomic status, right, how this is talking. So it illustrates those two concepts. One, that our language explodes at a rapid pace as we get older, and also how financial gaps and economic gaps can create achievement gaps. Okay, so that's everything. I think I clicked too far. Again, I'm doing this in one take, so hold on. Oh, more graphs, complexity of sentences, right? Parents who are high school graduates and college graduates, the difference there, just more education, better language, right? Okay, so I'm having issues with my PowerPoint here. I apologize. Yes, I'm going to leave this in because I don't. Here we go. We're back. Okay, great. Thanks again. Not in the interest of getting more of the stuff on here, there won't be a lot of editing. So, plus again, trying to mirror the classroom experience, me struggling with basic technology. Ironic here, sitting here using a computer at my house I built myself. I can't get PowerPoint to work super well. So just a little bit now at the end about literacy, reading and writing, and then how that develops, right? Reading, emergent literacy is the set of skills before we can actually read that help us get ready to read. It's emerging, right? It's the foundation for those academic skills. The biggest one, again, that interaction between adult and child. And that's why we're talking about this, to really hammer that point home. So you've got your dialogic reading, where an adult is reading to a child, right? And they both are going back and forth. So it's like, what happens next? And then he's like, he's going in the cave. What happens next, Daddy? And you're like, oh, I don't know. What do you think is going to happen? Like that going back and forth, even though they both read the book 100 times, right? It's practicing, right? It's practicing those story beats, right? The structure of language, but also like when we're reading, we understand beginning, middle, and end. Like we're practicing and learning those things in that back and forth. And there's kind of this acronym for how that tends to happen. This isn't something that people made up and said like, it's what should happen. This is based on observations of what actually happens when adults and children interact without being prompted to do this. They'll read the book. The adult will prompt the kid with something, right? The kid will respond. The adult will expand on that, and then they tend to repeat it. So you might say, if we're reading Go Dog Go, right, or whatever, it's like, how many dogs are in the trees? And the kid will say, there are 3 dogs. You're like, that's right, there are 3. Can you tell me what color they are? And the kid will say, they're yellow. And you'll say, that's right, there's 3 yellow dogs in the tree, right? And you'll go on through that kind of through the book, And again, think about it, right? Like I'm connecting the words you're saying to what I'm seeing, right? We're building general language skills, but it's working and reading because it's helping them understand the structure, right, of written word, which is a little bit different. I mean, it's similar to what we hear, but not exactly the same. We've talked about that. So when we get to school, there's a couple different ways that we do this. We do the phonics, the basic skills approach, where we talk about phonemes and morphemes and right letter sound relationships. Here's what these mouth sounds mean when we talk to brain meaning, right? Like they go together and how they connect. The whole language approach is a different way of doing it, where we're using we're just throwing you into the context, right? And we're going to read books that are interesting to you as little kids. So if it's my son, everything's either going to be Frozen or PJ Masks, right? If you read a book about that, he's going to be excited. Or if you really want to get him interested, it's ocean animals, right? If it's sea creatures, that boy is hooked. Okay, so if I wanted to teach him words and language and how to read, he's much more likely to read a sea creature book than he is to read a book about trains or something, just because that's his particular interest, right? But we're tying it to your life then. And then there's a balance, which uses a little bit of both. And this is what most people have experienced and what most of us have settled on, where we are learning the rules and then we kind of practice those in a holistic type setting, which tends to work pretty well, right? Writing is a little bit different though. The because it's typically just school, even though the basic writing skills develop before that. Reading is central to writing. It kind of comes first, right? Again, think about receptive language versus expressive language. It's a lot easier to hear something and understand than it is to generate your own novel meaning. And it's different for different languages, but for the most part, it kind of looks something like this, right? Where as I'm learning to write my name, I'm following the basic structure of a word, but here it looks more like actual letters. And then here, even though there's still mistakes, like this is actual language, right? As we go along in time, we're applying the structure to it, and we're able a little bit to, in just a few short months, right, connect again, because we're already used to working with structures here and applying rules when it comes to language. Beyond that, reading and writing, kids tend to spell in their own kind of inventive ways, right, before they learn the rules. They don't follow them very well early on, but they quickly gain them. They're working on these two different ideas of knowledge telling versus knowledge transforming, which is, telling you, right? I'm just repeating to you. I'm telling you, it's just like verbatim, where it's just transforming. I'm changing it in some way. I'm adding my own spin on it, right? I'm giving you my own opinions about it, maybe, or I'm connecting it to something else, or I'm differentiating in some way, right? Versus just like, what can you tell me about this? So an idea of that might be like, what does that look like? Oh, well, that's red. Red is my favorite color. Did you know all these other things are red? And, red and yellow make orange if you put them together. Like, I'm adding to that and I'm elaborating on it. And, as we're able to do that better, right, we're better able to then read and write, especially writing, right? Because as I can do that verbally, I can produce that on the page a little bit better, because that's the expressive skills, generating ideas, getting more complex. Which really interesting, just for if you're looking for more things to do, is the connection between electronic communication, things like testing, and writing. The physical skills are different, but the cognitive skills are pretty similar, right? Like being able to produce this stuff in written word and how that compares to our spoken word, right? And so we're ending there. The slide has bilingualism. We're going to stop talking about that right now. Thanks everybody for listening. Again, if you have questions, send them in to me whenever you're listening to this. And that's all for this chapter. Thank you.